Ian Helfant is a professor of environmental studies and Russian and Eurasian studies at Colgate University. His research focuses on human-animal studies, ecocriticism, and the significance of wolves in ecosystems. Ian, thank you so much for taking the time today.
It's my pleasure, Joe. I really appreciate your inviting me.
So to start, could you talk a little bit about your sustainability journey, starting from maybe the work you did on your PhD dissertation?
Sure. So you and I had our little pre-conversation, which I really enjoyed. And I think one of the themes that came up that I'd like to talk about is the fact that so many of us, we're trained in whatever way we are. We have our careers. And yet, over the last decades, I think it's become more and more clear to so many of us that the world is in a pretty dire place in a lot of respects, and that sustainability is key to so many different um, better futures. And so I got my PhD in 1997 in Slavic languages and literatures. It was an 8-year PhD program. I had to study 4 different languages: Russian, Polish, French, German, and actually wrote my dissertation on gambling in 19th century Russia. It was called The High Stakes of Identity. Um, and so I enjoyed that. Well, not every year of it, not every day of it, but I came out of graduate school, got this job at Colgate University, and pretty clearly saw that the university was kind of conventional in the sense that there wasn't really a big awareness of sustainability. We didn't have an office of sustainability. It just wasn't really part of the campus culture. And meanwhile, it's the early 2000s because I started here in 1998. And it was just becoming more and more clear. It's sort of the Al Gore era where he came out with some of his first documentary on climate change. And it was just becoming more and more clear to me that was something I wanted to be involved in. So we went to the president of the university, Rebecca Chop, and proposed a sustainability council. And that was in 2005. We actually originally called it the Environmental Council. And then we kind of gathered sort of like thinkers, from around the campus, both faculty and staff and administrators. And we really made incredible progress in terms of just getting people here to be aware of all the different issues. The way we keep our grounds, the way for example, I collaborated with a forester on our forestry stewardship plan, which was super fun for me because I love trees, but I had never had the chance to, collaborate with a professional forester like that. And then in 2009, we were able to hire a sustainability coordinator whose name is John Pamilio, and he's now an associate provost of sustainability, which is a pretty high level administrative position. And that period from 2009 to 2019, when Colgate became carbon neutral through a combination of reducing our carbon footprint and also purchasing carbon offsets, we reduced our footprint by about 60%. So it's very, very significant. I'm deeply proud of the kind of progress we made on all those different fronts. And those, my work on that became as important to me as the kind of continuation of my scholarship. So I came out with my second book on wolves, which we'll talk about in 2018. But meanwhile, I had, for example, served as associate dean of the faculty, and always for me, working on, for example, Colgate's first climate action plan was really, really important. So one great thing about academics, I would argue, is that especially at a place like this, which is a sort of small to medium-sized liberal arts college in a really rural area, you can kind of bring together the different aspects of your personality in a way that is incredibly rewarding. And the institution has really allowed me to kind of evolve in that way. So, originally I had a position in the Russian department, and that became the Russian Eurasian Studies program. And I chaired it for 6 years. And then in 2014, I got a joint position with environmental studies. And then I actually chaired environmental studies from 2018 to 21. And, we have like 40 to 45 majors every year. So it's a great, large and growing sort of community of students and faculty. And then meanwhile, I know I'm kind of going on about this. I actually got elected to the town council of Hamilton. We're a tiny little town in the middle of central New York. Our town is really only a few thousand people, 3 or 4,000 people plus all the students. So it gives you a chance to really have an impact in a sort of a very, very kind of intimate scale. And especially with the national, political situation right now, it's been very important to me to feel like there's a way that an individual like myself can actually have an impact in a meaningful way.
Yeah, your experience sounds super interesting to me, and I'd love to dig into some of it. Your path to the Colgate Sustainability Council is super interesting to me, and I'm curious what your experience was doing the climate action planning early on, and also we'll get into the your scholarship as well, but just kind of how that related to your teaching and research at the time.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So basically it all kind of organically kind of intertwined. So for example, this is all coming back to me in 2008, I co-taught the environmental studies senior seminar with an economist and a physicist, which was just this great privilege. And we co-taught it on alternative energy. And we had these amazing, students who were seniors. And that type of experience taught me about things that, I didn't know very much about alternative energy before that. And then meanwhile, as I work toward the position in environmental studies, we have, the curriculum has evolved over the years, but let me give you an example that maybe kind of brings it to the very present. So this last spring, I taught, again, with a biologist. Actually, we co-taught the new version of our senior seminar. And it's basically a community-based research class. So the students were primarily working on sort of landscape issues. So, for example, we have a local conservation trust, and they work with local landowners who are donating land, for example, to ensure that that land is preserved and stewarded appropriately. It's called the Southern Madison Heritage Trust. So we had a group of students working with that group, with the trust, to basically come up with a stewardship plan for the 40 acres that's being donated by this very generous family in the area. And then we had other students working on similar projects. We had a group of students working with a local conservation center, like an educational center called the Rogers Center. And they were working on maple syrup production and the ways in which the Rogers Center could involve their community and their volunteers in a way, basically drawing upon this very cool concept of the gift economy. That has been like promoted by this very cool indigenous author who also wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer. And so our students basically worked with the director of that center to say, we believe that you could incorporate volunteers and members of the community into producing maple syrup and basically gift them maple syrup in return, as opposed to, for example, trying to do it in a more commercial way. So these types, oh, and then I had another group of students working with me as a town counselor because Hamilton and the village, and I was involved with this through chairing this group called the Hamilton Climate Preparedness Working Group, which came into existence in 2016. And I'm currently chairing it. And we've kind of rotated the chair over the years among both faculty at Colgate, but also community members. And so a group of students, four young women, were working on climate smart recertification for both the town and the village. It gets back to that issue that we were talking about before, for like the national level and all the setbacks that I would argue we're experiencing under the current administration. But at the local level, the state and municipalities, even ones as small as Hamilton, there are things that we can do. So these students this semester worked with local officials, including myself, to basically complete the greenhouse gas inventory for the municipalities of the town and the village. And that's very heavy duty work, all kinds of spreadsheets that are sort of beyond me, but the students are very good at it. And they're totally set up for this type of job market now, where there are many companies and many municipalities that are grappling with their greenhouse gas emissions, right? Their carbon emissions. So I'm trying to remember your original question, but in terms of how it's all come together, it's the institution has really evolved so strongly in this direction. So, for example, We have so-called green ambassadors, and we have many administrative assistants, for example, at Colgate, who are now very deeply invested in sustainability, and they're training their colleagues about it. You can get sort of various badges. They've almost gamified it in the way that we talk about nowadays, where it's like a competition to become the greenest person. And we have awards, and we have a yearly award ceremony where people are, recognized for this type of thing.
Yeah, that's amazing that so much work has been done and continuing to be done at Colgate. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about your research, your scholarship, and ask you kind of some foundational questions. What is human animal studies, and why is it important?
Thanks, Jeff. So human animal studies, I would argue, and there's many definitions of it, as there are probably people writing about it. That's the way that professors tend to be. Um, so in my view, human animal studies is kind of a branch of ecocriticism, and then more broadly of cultural studies. So kind of taking a step at a time, right? My first book was on gambling and the ways in which these young Russian noblemen would, gamble away large sums in a way that I found confounding and sort of strange. Like, why would they do that? And I basically became convinced it was part of their way of expressing their identity. And then after that, I looked actually at the ways that women typically suffered from the things that these men did, because the men were, it was a patriarchal society, so the men tended to have control. Now, this is going to sound strange, and I always say this to my students, don't, this sounds like a strange segue, but as I wrote about women and the ways that they suffered at the hands of men in many cases, I realized that there was this whole other population of creatures that were also suffering at the hands of humanity. And that was animals in general, and for example, wolves in particular in 19th century Russia, because originally my specialization was 19th century Russian culture and literature, right? So I went on three different research trips to Russia from 2012 through 2014. And then I basically was looking for a way in which to kind of engage with the sort of story of Russian nature, and then wolves became more and more prominent in terms of how I interpreted the 19th century in Russia. So in terms of human animal studies, if you look at an animal like wolves, and if you look at a country like Russia, what became clear to me, and it really kind of took time to sort of, to gel like this, to sort of coalesce, was that wolves were seen as symbolic of Russia, and that they also kind of became this locus for a lot of the kind of anxieties that were preoccupying Russians in the 19th century. So, for example, serfdom was abolished in Russia in 1861. So they beat us with our abolition of slavery by a few years. It's interesting that the times were so close, right? And that meant that wolves, before the abolition of serfdom in Russia, Russian noblemen had pursued wolves on horseback and with borzoi hounds. And there's this whole cultural institution, which is one chapter of my book on wolves, that talks about, the way that Russian noblemen saw hunting wolves with their borzois as a sort of stamp of nobility and of masculinity. And when serfdom was abolished, that became much more difficult. In other words, maintaining a kennel of 100 hounds, including many borzoi hounds, became just this incredible expense that, the nobility increasingly couldn't afford. And then meanwhile, peasants now, who had been serfs, were more and more aware of their rights over time, although you eventually get to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So clearly, they continue to be misused in many different ways. But the whole situation in the countryside became somewhat anarchic. And there was this period where wolves actually proliferated. So Russians, including Russian scientists in sort of the 1880s, 1890s, became really concerned that wolves were multiplying, and sort of they talked about wolves running into the city. And there were these stories about rabid wolves running into villages. Like one story, I actually begin my book with this, runs into a Russian village at midnight And the village is called the Village of the Evangelists. And it's January of 1863, as I recall. And the wolf supposedly bites 63 people. And you might say that's impossible. It just doesn't, it stretches, credulity, right? So part of the book is about, well, when you think about a culture and then you think about an animal, in what ways are they interwoven? In what ways can one lend insight into the other? And ultimately, really, what is the responsibility of us humans to steward and really cherish, these various types of creatures that we share the world with? Um, so maybe that's enough to say in answer to your question for now.
Yeah, I'm curious what are just kind of expanding on that idea. What are the things that are the implications of um, for example, wolves uh, on the culture? What were the things that changed when there were more wolves? Was it just more storytelling about the wolves? Were there more cases of wolves impacting livestock or other um, ecosystems in different ways? And what was the kind of response to all that?
Well, thank you for asking. So what I think is most interesting is that um, in actual fact, wolves were not really doing so much damage. That, for example, if you compare it to like fires in Russia, there was both arson but also natural fires because Russian villages typically were built out of wood, and so fires were this terrible problem late in the Russian Empire, right? And some people argued that wolves were practically an equally terrible problem. I personally don't buy that argument. I think that just as you see nowadays, really, among certain people and the way they talk about wolves. I think that wolves do not create the kinds of problems that they're often sort of ascribed with, if that's the right way to say, right? But they provide a kind of a vehicle um, for encapsulating a lot of the concerns that people have about lack of control, the possibility of a violent death, the idea that we are not supreme rulers of our environment, right? So what was particularly interesting to me was in sort of the 1870s, 80s, 90s, right? You had kind of competing interpretations of wolves, kind of getting to your question. So you had, on the one hand, hunters, and who continued to promote the idea of, if possible, eradicating wolves, but certainly controlling them, and who would do things like stage like a kind of it's like a bull sort of a version of a bullfight, right? They would capture wolves, they would keep them in cages, and then they would release them, for example, in the main race course in Moscow, like in this big stadium area. And they would have competitions where rival packs of borzoi hounds would then pin the wolves down, sometimes repeatedly, in front of paying audiences, and so that and they would kind of tabulate the results of that, and certain packs would be considered to be especially proficient, etc. But then meanwhile, starting in 1865, you had the Russian Society for the Imperial Society for the Protection of Animals came into being, right around the same time that the Humane Society in the US came into being as well, by the way. So again, another parallel. There are all these parallels between America and Russia, in that period that people don't tend to recognize. And so the Humane Society found these competitions to be horrific and, inhumane, and they actually focused especially upon the kind of dehumanizing impact that it had upon the audience, especially if there were women and children in the audience, as they would portray it, right? So you had this conflict between people who felt that uh, animals in general and wolves in particular deserved kind of moral consideration, to use a term that is used in human animal studies quite a bit. That they simply, because of their being, because of their capacity for suffering, that we as the most powerful of the animals owe it to our brethren to cherish them, right? And then you also had a whole series of works of literature that came out, even by people like Chekhov, the very famous writer, and also by lesser known writers, in which wolves were portrayed much more sympathetically. So, and there's many different examples, but one of the things that I found really interesting is in general, when you think about the way that we portray animals, whether it be in films or in literature, there are these choices we have to make. Should we anthropomorphize them, make them human-like? And there's this very interesting scholar who argues that when you write animals, if you give them human language, so like literally they talk to each other, right? Then we as humans, as readers, let's say, enter into kind of a ethical relationship with these animals. And this writer, Susan Ellick, I think it's Susan, argues that that's one of the reasons that authors tend to like give animals language like that. It's an interesting argument. If you think about I talk with my students a lot about this. When they think about animals, a lot of their views of animals come from Disney movies, for example.
Mm.
Those movies that you see as a kid, they really do sink into you and they become part of the way that you perceive the world and animals as well, right? So let me think. I forget if I've gone past your question or not answered it.
No, yeah, that was really good. And I'm also wondering about like the impact of wolves or the predators that we view in certain ways, the impact that we have on their populations, and then how that impacts the ecosystem. I remember a while back there was a video about reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone and all the different dynamics that happened because of that. Is the way we're viewing the animals also, by extension, how we're viewing the environment?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And so, Yellowstone is the kind of famous example where they were reintroduced in the mid 90s. And, conservation biologists will emphasize the fact that they created a kind of what they call an ecology of fear. Sounds great, right? But of course, not so much for humans, but for example, the elk herds, the ungulates that live in Yellowstone, so the elk and the deer, etc. So what they mean by that is that the elk were overly eating, sorry to be not more, they were eating a lot of the willows that were down by the riverbeds. So they were congregating in sort of the low-lying areas where there was more shelter and more food. And as a result, the kind of riparian systems by the streams in Yellowstone were suffering. They were being over-foraged, right? And when you reintroduce the wolves, they created this ecology of fear. And the elk they tended to disperse more. So they didn't congregate in the same way, which would make them vulnerable to, the wolf's predation. And so the argument that people make, that wildlife ecologists will often make, is that by reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone as a kind of apex predator or keystone species, those terms are kind of interrelated, although not exactly identical. You created a situation in which the entire ecosystem benefited. And so I do subscribe to that interpretation. I think that's accurate on the whole. There are other kind of interesting examples. For example, there was a scholar at University of Wisconsin who argued that she's at Wesleyan now. Her name has escaped me, but she's an economist. And she wrote a very interesting article on the relationship between wolves, livestock, and also wild ungulates, which is, deer, elk, etc. But also traffic fatalities. So this is just like an interesting thing that your audience might find kind of interesting. That in fact, her argument is that wolves in Wisconsin became more numerous over time, over the last few decades. And what happened is that wolves actually would tend to use roadways, at night in particular, as a way of getting from one place to another. They were relatively comfortable, which is surprising. I wouldn't have thought this, moving along roadways to get from one place to another. And her argument is that as a result, ungulates tended to avoid those roadways. And basically, there was a decrease in traffic fatalities. And she calculated that that it was equal to the equivalent, I think it was billions of dollars, if I recall correctly. So, you obviously want to find that original research if you're interested. Apparently, it's the most downloaded article from the Wesleyan, site at this point, which is just interesting. Obviously, people do find wolves to be very interesting, right?
Yeah.
So there are these connections. I personally do belong to that group of people who think that wolves and large predators in general belong in our world and that they play a vital role as apex predators, as a keystone species, and that we can coexist with them. It's true of grizzly bears. It's true of many different types of predators, snow leopards, lions and tigers. Although, the fact is that if you go to a place like India where tigers are still very much present, they do predate upon people. So,
Mm.
it's I think a lot of people feel that, we are sort of masters of the universe at this point, and we should have the right to kind of eliminate any type of risk along those lines. And I guess I do believe that we should be willing to exist with a certain amount of risk, as just one of the species on this planet.
And I mean, a big part of that is the value that those species provide, right? Um, the complexity of the ecosystems, and not have, if we weren't to have those animals, we would be potentially worse off, right?
I think in my opinion, that's true. Again, you will have people argue it both ways. But I think that, if you think about, deer, we have a great overpopulation of white-tailed deer in the US, in the continental US at this point. And so it's pretty clear that they actually create far greater issues for us than, I would argue, either having mountain lions or wolves as part of our systems, of our different state ecosystems would be. Like, if you just think about traffic accidents and traffic fatalities and economic damages, um, the figures for deer car collisions, as many of your audience probably has experienced, are they're almost catastrophic. I mean, they're extremely significant. And so, if you look at states like, Wyoming or Alaska or other places where large predators are present, the or California with mountain lions, yes, of course, you do occasionally hear about instances where pets or people are attacked by wild animals, but it's quite rare. And if you then compare that, for example, to fatalities caused by people hitting deer, those far outweigh the risk of predators. And I'm not talking about saying as many predators as possible. I'm not saying that at all. Predators tend to kind of be quite restricted in number because they require a large population of prey, and there's kind of a cycle where, if they get too numerous, then there aren't enough prey for them.
Mm.
So
Yeah, I wonder if we can loop back for a second to a more foundational question. What is eco-criticism, and how does that, you said human animal studies is within that. How do you define
mhm.
eco-criticism?
So again, you'll have a lot of different competing definitions, but in my view, I think one thing that we've all realized is that people can't be convinced by data alone. So I personally very much believe that climate change is happening and that it's a kind of existential crisis and threat that we need to collectively respond to. And so, in my view, eco-criticism is one of the ways in which people can be sort of attuned to that, people can learn about that. So, eco-criticism essentially looks at the relationship between humans and nature, largely through cultural production. So that would include things like literature, like art. So picture, for example, like a view of the Arctic Ocean, and you see what you think. I'm thinking of a specific image when I say this, and you think you see icebergs floating on the top of the ocean. And then you look closer and you realize that the artist has actually used plastic bags as a way to kind of represent icebergs, but they look so much like icebergs because of the particular way that it's photographed that you're convinced originally that they were icebergs, but then suddenly you realize that they're plastic bags, right? And so you have this kind of sudden emotional shock when you think, oh my God, that's not what I thought it was. And in fact, it's a human pollution that is, infiltrating this beautiful, pure, what we think of as, having been such a pure region. And then you realize that actually the Arctic is gathering, it's one of the places in the world that is, first of all, experiencing the most extreme effects of climate change, rapid warming, but also plastics are gathering in the Arctic because of the various ocean currents. So eco-criticism, in my view, is a way of explaining the relationship between humans and nature, drawing upon kind of cultural production in a way that uses either images, for example, or narrative to kind of attune people and make them care about these very significant changes that we are part of.
Yeah. Well, so just thinking in kind of a futuristic way, how do you see things changing over the next 10 to 20 years, and uh, how should we think about pursuing a sustainable future for the planet, and also some of these things that you mentioned, like the role of predators and maybe also eco-criticism in our public discourse?
So that's a very large question. I'll do my best. When I talk to my students, one thing that I always try to emphasize, because they want to be hopeful. The last thing I would ever want to do as their teacher is to fill them with a sense of existential dread. And I do have colleagues who feel differently. They're like, no, the students should feel existential dread. So speaking to anyone who might, be interested in these things, I think it's very, very important to have hope. And we have to focus upon the parts of humanity and where we are actively striving to kind of confront what has already happened, what we're responsible for, and what we can do. It's always very inspiring to me to think of, people like Jane Goodall, who seems like such a go-to person for this kind of thing. But, she's people like that are so inspiring. And, they have seen such horrific things in their lives, including, for example, the way that animals are treated. But they somehow have a type of faith. It doesn't have to be a religious faith. It can be some sort of faith in human potential, or the potential for us to kind of be our best selves. And I think that, there are such examples really throughout the world. Um, we're going through what I would consider to be a pretty dark time, in terms of, it's kind of heartbreaking for me to see the rollback of a lot of our clean energy credits and such, because I do believe that those are so important. But, the US is just one country in a very large world. And I think that, you look at, to get to the second part of your question, you look at the way that wolves have come back into Central, even Western Europe, and it's interesting right now to watch the Europeans dealing with that. My mom happens to be Swedish, and I have a lot of colleagues in Europe, including in Germany, for example, Poland, and the Netherlands. And right now, wolves have been considered in Europe, in the EU, to be endangered, critically endangered over the last decades. And right now that question is being revisited because their populations are getting to be large enough. I think I might have heard the figure of 20,000 in the EU. I may be misspeaking, but I think that's accurate, which is pretty significant. Um, in general, when large carnivores go below 10,000, you start to get really concerned. And so it's starting, wolves actually worldwide, it's a couple 100,000, as I understand it. So it's not like they're truly critically endangered. They're not like polar bears, which may be, 30,000 or fewer at this point, let alone, snow leopards, tigers, different subspecies of tigers. So when you look at the ways in which, one thinks of the EU as being pretty environmentally focused and sort of at the cutting edge, maybe, of world environmental sort of approaches to environmentalism. So seeing how they're trying to sort of balance their desire to have animals like wolves be part of their ecosystems, along with these other considerations, human safety. I think it's instrumental. We have to look to examples like that and look around the world. And in some cases, like if you look at Kenya, there's this group of former lion hunters, who are now among the Maasai, who are now they are now lion protectors. There's actually a group called, I believe, the Lion Protectors, and they've taken a lot of what was part of their culture that involved lion hunting and killing of lions, and now they've made that into protecting of lions, which are so central to their cultural identity. So there are all kinds of ways in which we humans can kind of transcend our pasts and become better versions of ourselves. And I do think that if you keep your eyes open, you'll see examples like that really around the world.
That's awesome. And thank you so much for ending on an inspiring note. It's really great to hear about all the work going on globally. Thank you so much for taking the time, Ian. Really appreciate you. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Sounds good, Joe. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me.